My name is Harold Whitmore. I turned 76 this spring, and though my body has begun to betray me in ways I never imagined during the years when I worked from sunrise to sunset, my mind still clings to the small rituals that make life bearable. I live in a modest clapboard house on the outskirts of Cedar Rapids, Iowa, a place that once rang with the laughter of children and the bustle of family dinners, but now sits mostly silent, except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway and the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Every morning I wake up slowly, not because I am lazy, but because rising has become an ordeal. My knees ache as if ground glass were lodged inside the joints, and my lower back protests the simple motion of swinging my legs over the side of the bed. Still, when I finally stand, I take a deep breath and remind myself that I am alive, that my heart continues to beat, and that despite the years that weigh on me, I am still Harold, not a ghost, not a burden, not a piece of furniture to be dusted around. The first thing I do, after washing my face and staring for a long minute into the mirror where I barely recognize the man staring back, is prepare breakfast. It has been my custom for decades to start the day with eggs and a slice of bacon or sausage, and if I feel indulgent, a small steak seared quickly in the pan until the outside is dark and the inside still pink. My late wife, Margaret, used to tease me, saying that I was half cow myself for the amount of beef I consumed in my lifetime, and I would reply with a wink that the only reason I had the strength to split firewood and repair fences into my 70s was the protein she kept feeding me. She has been gone 8 years now, taken by lung cancer that appeared suddenly and consumed her in less than a season. And there are mornings when the smell of sizzling meat feels like the only tether that binds me to those years when she sat at the table across from me, sipping her coffee and telling me the small gossip of the neighborhood. Without her, the ritual is less about eating and more about summoning the memory of her presence. As though by seasoning the pan with the same pinch of salt and pepper, I can coax her voice back into the kitchen for a fleeting instant. The children, of course, have different ideas about how I should live. My son, Michael, who works as a financial advisor in Des Moines, phones her regularly, always in a rush, always with that harried tone that suggests my words are one more obligation to be ticked off his long list of responsibilities. My daughter Elaine visits more often, though never alone. She brings her husband, Greg, a tall man with the smug smile of someone who believes he knows better than everyone else, and their 2 children, my grandchildren, who now look at me with that mix of awkwardness and faint disdain teenagers reserve for those they see as obsolete. Their visits are not the kind I used to dream of in my 60s when Margaret and I imagined a house full of grandchildren running through the yard. Instead, they arrive with an agenda, cleaning out my fridge of what they call hazardous food, replacing butter with margarine, red meat with tofu patties, cream with almond milk, as if erasing my taste were the same as extending my life. They speak of cholesterol levels and doctors' recommendations with the gravity of prophets, and I listen silently because if I interrupt, if I defend myself, they dismiss me with that dreadful phrase, "Dad, you don't understand. You're too old to know what's good for you anymore." It is strange. After 76 years of living, after decades of paying bills on time, raising children, working 6 days a week to provide, burying a wife with my own trembling hands, that the same children now look at me as though I were a reckless boy needing supervision. I am still the man who built the porch they sit on when they visit, the man who taught Michael how to cast his first fishing line and showed Elaine how to ride a bicycle without training wheels. But in their eyes I am reduced to a figure of fragility, a body to be managed, a liability waiting for a fall. I cannot walk into a butcher shop without hearing Elaine's scolding voice in my head. "Do you want to end up in the hospital, Dad? Do you want us to plan your funeral next week?" The cruelty of those words lies not in their intention, They claim they want me alive, but in their assumption that my life is nothing but an equation of risks to be minimized, that pleasure, autonomy, and dignity no longer belong to me. In truth, I am not a reckless eater. I do not gorge myself on ribs or drown in grease. My indulgences are modest. An 8-ounce steak once or twice a week, cooked carefully, savored with a glass of red wine. It is not gluttony, it is continuity, a reminder of who I am and where I come from. Iowa is beef country. I was raised in the smell of barns and the sound of cattle lowing at dawn. My father worked the land until his lungs gave out, and every Sunday dinner was centered around a roast or a stew that my mother prepared, with hands hardened by labor but gentle in the kitchen. To reject meat entirely would feel like rejecting the heritage of my family, like erasing the taste of my youth. Perhaps the doctors would scowl. Perhaps dietitians would wag their fingers. But to me, a life stretched longer at the cost of stripping away all that gives it flavor is not life, but a slow punishment. The neighbors still nod when they see me at the farmer's market, bag of fresh beef or pork in hand, though sometimes I catch their sideways glances, those brief flickers of curiosity mixed with judgment. Word has traveled, I suppose, through the tight channels of small-town gossip. Harold's kids say he shouldn't be eating that anymore. Harold is too stubborn for his own good. There is a peculiar kind of humiliation in realizing that your private choices have become a public debate, that people you hardly know feel entitled to weigh in on what you put on your plate, as though your age has stripped you of privacy as well as dignity. I find myself walking more quickly past the produce stalls, avoiding the eyes of acquaintances, clutching my bag of steak like contraband. It is a strange reversal. Once, food was the heart of community gatherings. Now it feels like evidence in a trial for which I never agreed to stand accused. Yet even as I write these words in the silence of my kitchen, I feel the stirrings of defiance. Age may bend the spine and slow the step, but it should not erase the right to choose. My children believe they are saving me from myself, but what they cannot grasp is that every morsel of meat I chew is not just sustenance. It is memory. It is resistance. It is proof that I am still Harold, the man who swung an axe in winter, who danced with his wife barefoot in the living room when no one was watching, who grilled steaks in the backyard while the children chased fireflies. To tell me I am too old to eat meat is not a dietary recommendation. It is a declaration that my story is over, that I must surrender the pen and let others write my final chapters. And I am not ready to do that. So here I sit, an old man with a frying pan, defying the condescension of children who believe wisdom belongs only to the young. I know the day will come when my body truly refuses, when chewing will be labor and digestion agony, when my own hands can no longer hold the knife steady. But that day is not today, and until it arrives I will season my steak, hear it sizzle, and breathe in the aroma of my own stubborn will. If they call me foolish, so be it. If they laugh, let them laugh. I would rather be mocked for living on my own terms than praised for existing on theirs. And if the price of that choice is conflict, estrangement, even loneliness, then at least it is the loneliness of a man who remains himself, not the quiet suffocation of one who has allowed his children to redefine him into nothing more than a fragile relic waiting for permission to breathe. It was a Sunday evening when the first real crack appeared, though perhaps, if I am honest, the fracture had been spreading silently for years, and I only noticed it then because the pain became impossible to ignore. Elaine had called earlier in the week to say she and Greg would be coming by with the kids for dinner, and though the tone of her voice carried that brisk efficiency of someone managing another task rather than extending a heartfelt invitation, I allowed myself to feel a small flicker of anticipation. I had not hosted a proper family meal in months, and I spent the better part of the day preparing the house, wiping the kitchen counters, dusting the shelves where Margaret's old teacups still sat, and even mowing the patchy lawn out front so the place would look welcoming. In the afternoon, I walked to the market and bought a pair of thick ribeye steaks, well marbled, the kind Margaret always said smelled like summer when they hit the grill. I imagined us sitting together as we once did, passing dishes, talking about nothing and everything. And though I knew times had changed, I wanted to believe that perhaps for a few hours we could pretend otherwise. When they arrived, it was with the usual flurry of noise and impatience. The children, Sarah now 16 and Daniel 14, barely looked up from their phones as they walked through the door, muttering distracted greetings before disappearing into the living room, where the television glowed with the endless churn of video games. Elaine placed a grocery bag on the counter and began unloading items I had not asked for. A carton of oat milk, a box of quinoa, and some plastic containers filled with what looked like pre-cooked lentils. "Dad," she said, with that mixture of command and exasperation I had come to dread, "I thought I told you. We're trying to keep things healthy. Greg has been reading about plant-based diets, and honestly, at your age, you should not be eating all that red meat." I smiled, trying to soften the moment, and gestured toward the counter where the steaks rested on a plate, glistening with a light rub of salt and pepper. "I thought I'd make something special," I said. "It's been a long time since we sat down together, and you know how much your mother loved when I grilled." Greg, standing behind her, let out a small laugh that was more sneer than amusement. "Harold, you're pushing 80. Steak is not a celebration anymore. It's a death sentence. You should be eating oatmeal or soup, not clogging your arteries with this garbage. What are you trying to prove? That you're still a cowboy?" His words hit me harder than I expected. I felt my face flush, not from shame, but from the sting of disrespect. I wanted to remind him that it was my house, my table, my effort that made the evening possible. But Elaine quickly intervened, taking the plate and sliding it toward the far end of the counter as if the meat were toxic. "Dad, seriously," she said, lowering her voice into that falsely gentle tone reserved for scolding a stubborn child. "You know what the doctor said last year about your cholesterol. You can't keep pretending you're 40. You're not. You need to think about us, about how we'd feel if something happened to you." Her words, framed as concern, felt more like accusation, and before I could respond, Sarah's voice floated from the living room. "Grandpa, you're too old to eat meat. Everyone knows it. You'll just choke or something." Laughter followed, the sound of both grandchildren mocking me from the safety of their glowing screens. And though I tried to tell myself they didn't mean it, that they were only parroting the words they had heard from their parents, the humiliation cut deep. I stood there for a moment, gripping the edge of the counter, the smell of raw beef mingling with the sharp scent of quinoa from Elaine's grocery bag, and felt the strange sensation of being displaced in my own kitchen. This was the room where Margaret and I had raised our children, where birthday candles had been blown out and Thanksgiving turkeys carved. Yet somehow in that instant it no longer belonged to me. It had become a stage for their disapproval, a place where my choices were not honored but scrutinized, corrected, erased. I muttered something about putting the steaks back in the fridge for another day and allowed Elaine to set the table with the lentils and quinoa, though my appetite had already evaporated. Throughout the meal, the tension thickened. Greg lectured me on the benefits of plant-based proteins, citing studies I suspect he only skimmed from an article online, while Elaine nodded approvingly as though he were some great authority. Every time I tried to change the subject, to ask Sarah about school, to ask Daniel about his music, my words were brushed aside or answered in monosyllables, and always the conversation returned to me, to my health, to what I should or should not be allowed to do. "We're just worried," Elaine repeated like a refrain. "We want you around for a long time." But beneath the surface of her words I could hear another tone, one I could not quite name yet, a sharpness that made me feel less like a loved father and more like a patient under evaluation. After dinner, while Elaine and Greg were in the kitchen tidying up, I stepped onto the porch to breathe. The night air was cool, and for a moment I closed my eyes and listened to the crickets, trying to summon the peace that used to come so easily. I thought about Margaret, about how she would have defended me, how she would have reminded Elaine that life was meant to be lived, not preserved in glass. I remembered how she used to press a kiss to my temple when I grilled on summer evenings, whispering that nothing in the world smelled as good as steak seasoned by my hands. The ache of her absence pressed against my chest, heavier than any cholesterol reading, and I realized then that what my children were taking from me was not merely food, but memory, identity, dignity. When I returned inside, I caught the sound of Elaine's voice, hushed but urgent, as she spoke to Greg. They hadn't noticed me lingering in the hallway. "We really need to watch him," she said. "He's not thinking straight anymore. Buying meat like that, ignoring what the doctor said. If he keeps this up, we might have to step in. Maybe even talk to someone about legal guardianship. It's not safe to let him handle things on his own." My heart stopped for a moment. Guardianship. The word echoed in my ears like a verdict. I stood frozen, gripping the doorframe, and for the first time, I felt a fear deeper than the fear of illness or death. It was the fear of being erased, of being declared incompetent, of being stripped of the little autonomy I had left. I did not confront them that night. Instead, I let them leave, with their half-hearted hugs and polite promises to call soon. When the door closed behind them and the silence of the house returned, I sat at the kitchen table staring at the plate of untouched steak in the fridge, and I felt a strange mixture of anger and sorrow. Anger that my children, my own flesh and blood, could speak of me as though I were already incapable, as though my mind were slipping when I knew it was not. Sorrow, because beneath their words, I recognized not only fear of losing me, but also something colder, something calculated, as if my life were a balance sheet and they were preparing to manage the assets once I could no longer resist. That was the moment, though I did not yet fully understand it, when the war began. It was not a war fought with weapons or armies, but with words, insinuations, humiliations, and the slow erosion of trust. They called me too old to eat meat, but what they truly meant was too old to decide, too old to resist, too old to live as I pleased. That night, as I sat alone in the quiet house with the echo of their laughter still stinging in my ears, I promised myself that I would not let them take everything. I did not yet know how I would fight back, but I knew I must. In the weeks that followed that Sunday evening, the tone of my children's visits began to change, in a way that was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but soon so unmistakable that even I, with all my attempts at patience, could no longer deny. What was happening? Elaine came by more frequently, sometimes alone, but often with Greg in tow. And instead of the warm gestures of a daughter dropping in to see her father, the visits had the flavor of inspections, as though my home had been reclassified from a dwelling to a ward under her supervision. She would arrive with bags of groceries I had not requested, most of them filled with foods I did not recognize. Containers of hummus, strange vegan cheeses, almond flour, and cans of sodium-free soups that tasted like boiled water. She unpacked them into my cupboards with the brisk efficiency of a nurse stocking supplies, and when I tried to protest that I had perfectly good food already, she would wave her hand as though brushing aside the words of a senile patient. One Saturday morning, I returned from the farmer's market with a small brown bag holding a cut of sirloin. Nothing extravagant, just enough for 2 modest meals. And when Elaine saw me placing it in the fridge, she let out a sigh so exaggerated it was, closer to a groan. "Dad, "We've talked about this," she said, her voice tightening with impatience. "You can't keep bringing this into the house. It's dangerous. Do you want me to throw it out for you?" The casual arrogance of that question struck me like a slap. Throw out my food in my own house, as if I were a child who had smuggled candy past a watchful parent. I told her firmly that the meat would stay, that I had chosen it and paid for it, and she responded with that dreadful look, a mixture of pity and superiority, shaking her head as if my insistence only confirmed her diagnosis that I was no longer in control of myself. Greg was worse. He had always carried himself with the air of someone convinced of his own superiority, but lately his remarks grew sharper, cutting at me under the guise of jokes. At one dinner, when I placed a pork chop on my plate, he smirked and said, "Careful there, Harold. You'll snap your dentures on that before it reaches your stomach." Sarah and Daniel laughed, delighted to see their grandfather reduced to a punchline, and though I forced myself to swallow both the food and the humiliation, inside I felt the embers of resentment glow hotter. It was not merely the words, but the way they looked at me afterward, with that half-amused, half-pitying gaze, as though I were a clown in the slow act of stumbling toward the grave. The grandchildren, once the light of my life, had learned to mimic their parents' disdain.
They no longer asked me to tell them stories about when their mother was young, no longer begged me to show them how to whittle a piece of wood or teach them how to bait a hook.
Instead, they filmed me with their phones when I was not aware, whispering to each other and stifling laughter. And later Elaine showed me a short video Sarah had uploaded online. In it, I was cutting into a piece of roast beef with deliberate care, my hand shaking slightly from arthritis, and the caption read, "Grandpa thinks he's still 20. Too old to chew meat without choking?" The comments from strangers, many of them mocking, some cruel, burned deeper than I cared to admit. I had lived long enough to bury my wife, long enough to see my hair turn white, but nothing prepared me for the experience of being ridiculed on the glowing screens of people I would never meet. My dignity reduced to entertainment. It was not just the food anymore. Slowly, other liberties began to vanish under their care. Elaine insisted on taking my car keys, claiming that my reflexes were too slow, though I had never been in an accident and still drove cautiously around town. When I resisted, she enlisted Greg, who said bluntly, "Do you want to kill a family on the road? Or yourself? You're not fit to drive anymore." I tried to argue that driving to the market was one of my few remaining pleasures, but they had already made up their minds. Within a week, the car was gone from the driveway, and I was left to rely on them for errands, a dependence that cut far deeper than they could understand. I felt trapped, diminished, as though each small freedom removed was another brick in the wall they were building around me. The nadir of this first escalation came on the evening of my birthday. For 76 years, I had marked the day not with grand parties, but with simple traditions. Margaret would bake a cake, the children would gather, and I would grill steaks in the yard no matter the weather, sometimes shivering in a coat by the barbecue. If the snow fell thick, but always with the conviction that a man should celebrate his years with the food he loves most. This time, Elaine announced she was taking over the planning, and though I tried to smile and allow her the gesture, I felt a chill of foreboding. On the day itself, the family arrived with a large cooler, cheerful voices filling the kitchen, but when the dishes emerged, they were not the foods of my memory. Instead of steak or roast, they set before me a plate of pureed vegetables, broccoli mashed into a green paste, carrots softened into pulp, and a small mound of flavorless lentil patties. "Happy birthday, Dad," Elaine said brightly, raising a glass of sparkling water. "We want you to make it to 90. So here's to many more years of healthy choices." Everyone clinked glasses, even the grandchildren, and laughter bubbled around the table. I forced myself to lift my own glass. But the shame was so sharp, it felt like a knife turning inside me. The children began to chant in playful tones, "No more steak for Grandpa, no more steak," as if it were a nursery rhyme. And Greg added, "We'll get you a blender next year so you don't have to chew at all." Sarah filmed the moment, giggling, and Daniel patted my shoulder with mock sympathy, saying, "Don't worry, Grandpa. Soon you'll forget you ever liked meat." I wanted to speak, to slam my hand on the table, to tell them that this was not care but cruelty, disguised in smiles. But the words stuck in my throat. The room blurred, and for the first time in my life, I felt not only old, but erased, a relic displayed at the head of the table for their amusement, stripped of the dignity that even age should not deny. That night, after they left with their leftover lentils and their laughter still echoing in the hall, I sat in the kitchen staring at the darkened window. In my refrigerator, the steak I had bought in secret 2 days earlier remained wrapped in butcher's paper, hidden behind the containers of quinoa Elaine had placed there. I took it out, unwrapped it slowly, and held it in my hands. It was not just meat, it was memory, identity, defiance. Tears blurred my eyes as I realized what my birthday had become. Not a celebration of life, but a rehearsal of my submission. A declaration that I was too old to choose, too old to eat, too old to live on my own terms. From that night forward, I understood that the battle was no longer about food alone. It was about control, about whether the years I had left would be mine or theirs. And though the humiliation still burned in my chest, it also kindled something else. A spark of defiance that whispered, I would not surrender quietly. That the man who had worked, fought, loved, and endured would not let himself be caged in his own home. It was during the spring, when the air first began to soften after the long Midwestern winter, that the situation shifted from mere irritation and humiliation into something darker, something that made me feel as though the very ground beneath my life was being rearranged without my consent. I had convinced myself that perhaps the birthday incident had been an aberration, an excess of misplaced zeal disguised as concern. But what followed proved it was not a single misstep. It was the start of a deliberate campaign, and I was not the participant, but the object, a man being managed rather than respected. The moment that crystallized this change came at a Sunday gathering, one that I had agreed to attend at Elaine's insistence. She had told me it would be just a small family dinner, and though I hesitated, still stung from the birthday humiliation, I told myself it would be cowardly to hide away, that perhaps things would be gentler this time. I dressed carefully, pressing my shirt and combing what little hair I have left. And I even brought a bottle of red wine I had been saving since before Margaret died, thinking maybe, just maybe, we might share something resembling warmth. The house was crowded when I arrived. Not just my children and grandchildren, but a couple of their friends from the neighborhood, a man in a neatly tailored suit, and his wife, both around Elaine's age, with those polished smiles that tell you they are used to being admired. At first I thought nothing of it. But as dinner began, I realized that my presence had been drafted into a performance. Instead of a simple family meal, it became a stage for Elaine and Greg to showcase how they were taking care of me. And the centerpiece of that performance was my supposed incapacity. The table was laden with dishes that looked colorful but tasted like cardboard, steamed vegetables, saltless casseroles, some grain salad that clung to the fork like glue. I tried to be polite, though the smell of it made my stomach ache for something honest. But soon the conversation turned to me, as though I were not a guest, but a specimen. Elaine, smiling sweetly at the couple, said, "Dad is stubborn, but we manage. We have to watch him closely these days. He forgets things. Just last week he almost started a fire by leaving the stove on." I felt my body stiffen. That had never happened. I had not cooked at her house in months, and I always checked my burners before leaving the kitchen. Greg laughed in agreement and added, "And he keeps sneaking whiskey, even though it's terrible for his blood pressure. We have to pour it down the drain when we find it." Again, a lie. I had not touched whiskey in years, though I allowed myself a glass of red wine now and then, quietly, in the evenings when the loneliness grew too heavy. I set down my fork, staring at them, trying to decide whether to explode in fury or remain silent. The couple smiled with a kind of indulgent sympathy, nodding knowingly as if they too had dealt with troublesome elders. The humiliation burned hotter than anything I had yet endured, because this was not only about food or drink. It was about my name, my reputation, my very sanity. They were fabricating a portrait of me as a doddering fool, a man unfit to manage his own affairs, and they were doing it publicly, turning me into a cautionary tale before strangers. When I tried to interrupt to say that these stories were false, Elaine patted my arm gently, the way one soothes a confused child, and said, "Don't worry, Dad. No need to get upset. Everyone understands." The room filled with polite laughter, and in that laughter I heard the sound of my authority being dismantled brick by brick. Later that evening, when I excused myself to use the restroom, I paused in the hallway and overheard them speaking in hushed tones to the couple. Greg was saying, "It's tough, but we'll manage. We're looking into guardianship options just in case. Better to be prepared before he does something dangerous with his accounts or the house." The man responded with sympathetic murmurs, and Elaine sighed theatrically, adding, "He doesn't realize it yet, but we're only protecting him from himself." My heart raced as I remained hidden in the shadows, listening to my daughter, my own flesh and blood, quietly plotting to take away the independence I had spent a lifetime protecting. Guardianship. The word carried with it the image of being locked away. Decisions made for me, my money, my home, my daily choices all siphoned into their hands under the banner of protection. It was in that moment that I understood the birthday dinner had not been clumsy affection, but strategy. I returned to the table with my face carefully composed, forcing a smile, because I understood that revealing my anger would only feed their narrative, would only become another story of my outbursts. Inside, however, something cold and steady began to form. I had tolerated their condescension. I had endured their jokes. But this was different. This was no longer about whether I ate steak or quinoa. It was about whether I remained a man or became an object. I felt the weight of Margaret's absence then more than ever, because she would have known how to confront them without breaking apart, how to shield me with her quiet but unshakable dignity. Without her, I was alone, but alone did not mean powerless. That night when I returned home, I sat in the dim kitchen and poured myself the glass of wine I'd meant to share with them. I raised it to the silent house, to the memory of my wife, and I whispered aloud, "They think I am too old to eat meat. They think I am too old to live. But they are wrong." The bitterness of betrayal mingled with the wine on my tongue, and though I felt sorrow pressing at the edges of my heart, I also felt a grim determination hardening within me. If they were preparing to declare me incapable, then I would show them just how capable I remained. The battle lines had been drawn, and though they believed me too feeble to fight, they would soon learn that even an old man, cornered and underestimated, can sharpen his dignity into a weapon. In the weeks after that dinner, where guardianship was floated like a harmless word, the machinery behind my children's concern revealed itself gear by gear, not with one dramatic clang, but with the low, relentless grinding of something large that had already been set in motion, and I began to understand that what I had taken for clumsy love was in fact a plan, tidy and efficient, whose first objective was to separate me from my money and my choices. and whose second was to persuade the world that it was all for my own good. It started with a phone call that arrived on a Tuesday morning while I was trimming the fat from a small chuck roast. A call from Elaine delivered in that clipped professional tone she uses when she wants to make sure no one mistakes kindness for negotiation. She said she had scheduled a routine wellness check with a geriatric care manager recommended by a friend, and that the lady would stop by to make sure the house is safe and you're eating properly. And though I said I hadn't requested any evaluation and didn't need a stranger to tell me how to live in a home I built with my own hands, Elaine breezed past my objection as if it were a gust of wind rattling a closed window and assured me it would be quick, painless, and entirely for my benefit. The woman arrived 2 days later in soft-soled shoes and a smile that never reached her eyes, carrying a clipboard fat with forms. And she walked through my rooms with the air of a landlord inspecting a tenant, opening cabinets, peering into the refrigerator where I had tucked my roast behind the plastic tubs of quinoa and steamed vegetables Elaine delivered like rations, asking me, in a voice sweetened for the very old, to count backward by sevens and to remember 3 words, apple, table, penny, before asking me to repeat them again while she timed me with her phone. I did as she asked, not because I felt obliged, but because I wanted the record to show, even in her tidy handwriting, that my mind was not the crumbling barn they wished to paint for the court. When she left, she patted my shoulder and told me, with practiced gravity, that independence is wonderful as long as it is safe. And only later did I learn that her visit had generated a report, and that report had been forwarded to a lawyer I had never met, and that lawyer had attached it to a draft petition for temporary guardianship, bearing my name in the space reserved for the incapacitated. On the Friday after her visit, I experienced the new humiliations of a man whose children have raised quiet flags in places he cannot see. At the butcher's counter, where I have bought meat for 40 years, my debit card was declined. And when I told the butcher there must be a mistake, he leaned in with the embarrassed sympathy of a man asked to enforce an order he does not agree with, and said that my daughter had been by that morning with a printed note. She asked them to tape all but invisibly to the register, "Please call me if Harold attempts to purchase red meat. Doctor's orders." And though the butcher shrugged and said he was sorry and that he didn't like to stand between a man and his supper, the damage was done, because the clerk in line pretended to study the gum while listening, and a woman I recognized from church pretended not to recognize me. And in that shame, I felt something both childish and very old, the hot flush that says you have been reduced in public, and a calm beneath it that says you will not forget who did it. At the bank that afternoon, I learned why the card had failed. Elaine had spoken to the branch manager, a man young enough to be my grandson, and filed a vulnerable adult alert on my accounts, which triggered new limits and demanded that any transaction above a modest threshold require verification by a designated family contact. And when I told the manager that I had not designated my daughter to manage my purchases, he smiled gently and said the alert was temporary, a precaution until we get things sorted. And he asked if there was anyone else who could help me with my finances and whether I had considered a durable power of attorney to simplify matters. And in that moment I understood that my daughter had not merely wagged a finger at my diet, but had laid hands on the levers I had kept safely under my own control for 7 decades. The grandchildren, who had once begged me to show them how to flip a steak without losing the juices, now played constable and customs officer in my kitchen, opening drawers and tapping on jars as if they contained contraband, narrating their search for their social media audience with the cheerful cruelty of the young, who have not yet understood that dignity is a currency you never stop needing. Sarah found the wrapped butcher paper where I had hidden it behind the lettuce and held it up like a He seized weapon while Daniel filmed and snickered. And when Greg entered, he performed surprise, took the package from her hand, and read aloud the weight and cut as if he were reading a charge in a courtroom, then dropped it into the trash with a theatrical sigh and announced for the benefit of his invisible viewers that this house was now a meat-free zone, because letting Grandpa buy steak is elder abuse he commits against himself. Elaine, who used to cry when she scraped a knee, and I carried her inside, told me that she had changed the locks on the garage because she was afraid I would use the grill unsupervised. And I discovered the next day that she had removed the propane tank altogether, leaving the metal body like a plucked bird in the corner as a reminder of the things I was no longer allowed to do. Then came the paperwork, a blizzard of envelopes that arrived thick and official, and each one was another signpost on the road they had chosen for me, a letter from Social Security informing me that an application had been filed to appoint a representative pay for my benefits because of reported difficulty managing funds, a packet from a senior living facility called Heritage Oaks, welcoming me for a pre-reserved respite stay beginning the 1st of next month with a non-refundable deposit already paid from an account in my name that I had not authorized them to touch, and a cheerful brochure from a nutrition service for older adults confirming my subscription to a weekly delivery of pureed meals billed quarterly to my card. At the local SSA office, where the fluorescent lights hum with a kind of weary government song, I waited my turn and told the clerk that I needed to revoke whatever application had been submitted in my name, and she showed me a form with Elaine's handwriting and a box tick that claimed I had suffered memory impairment. And though the clerk was kind and reversed it with a frown that told me she had seen this before, I felt the peculiar helplessness of a man who must defend the obvious truth of his own competence against the soft armies of paperwork and procedure. In the middle of all this, I went to church on a Sunday because I needed to sit somewhere that reminded me of Margaret's hand in mine and of the long, slow rhythm of something larger than our little wars. And as I walked down the aisle to my usual pew, I heard the murmur of whispers that carry no words you can quote later, but leave a wet film you cannot wash off. After the service, Pastor Tom approached with the earnest face of a man summoned to an intervention, saying he had received a call from Elaine, who was worried about your diet and your decision-making, and would I be open to prayer and perhaps a conversation with a counselor about accepting the changes of age. And I thanked him for the prayers because I won't turn down a blessing. But I told him as calmly as I could that acceptance of age does not include surrendering one's right to chew, and that living a few more years in the absence of joy is a sentence, not a gift. In the parking lot, a neighbor I have known since our kids played in the same t-ball league asked me, with that chirping concern people use when they are sure of their goodness, whether I had considered a plant-based transition. And I smiled and said I had considered a transition back to minding one's own business. Financial bruises began to appear like fingerprints after a rain. A bill arrived for a credit card I had not opened. The charges a tidy list of purchases that smelled like Greg. Sports club initiation fees, specialty coffee subscription, premium e-streaming bundles. And when I called the company, the woman on the line told me the application had been completed online using my Social Security number and a phone number that matched Elaine's. And though the charges were eventually reversed, the knowledge remained, a bitter little seed from which suspicion sprouted like a weed. At the bank, I discovered a monthly management transfer set up to move a few $100s from my savings to a joint account I had not used in years, 60 years, the description reading simply, household assistance. And when I asked the teller to trace it, she looked at the screen, then at me, and said, "Perhaps I should discuss this with my family." I told her I would discuss it with my lawyer once I had one. And on the walk home, I resolved that if my children had decided to treat me like a threat to their future, then I would become the most inconvenient threat they had ever faced. Not with shouting or fists, but with meticulous records and a spine stiffened by righteous anger. They tried soft coercion next, dressing it in the language of kindness. Elaine arrived with a brochure for a trial week at Heritage Oaks and suggested we take a drive, just to look. And when I demurred, she told me keeping an open mind was a sign of maturity, as if I were the child this time and she the parent. And Greg chimed in with a sermon about falls and bathroom hazards and the tragic statistics of men my age who break a hip and never recover. And I listened without interrupting because interruption would only have been fed into their file as evidence of agitation. Then I put on my coat and walked them to the door and said, in the same even tone I once used with my own children when they crossed a line, that their visit was over and we would speak again when respect returned to the room. The next day a woman from Adult Protective Services knocked, apologetic, to perform a wellness check based on an anonymous report of self-neglect and unsafe cooking practices. I showed her the kitchen, clean as any hospital, the list of medications, neatly labeled, the calendar where I mark appointments and bill dates, the pantry stocked not only with the soft foods Elaine approves but also with the meat I refuse to apologize for. And though she left satisfied, promising to note that I required no intervention, the indignity of being evaluated like a stray dog clung to my clothes long after I closed the door. That evening the butcher called me at home, his voice gruff with embarrassment, because Elaine had returned to his shop with a typed letter on a lawyer's letterhead stating that, until further notice, any vendor who knowingly sells high-risk foods to Mr. Whitmore may be contributing to medical harm. And he wanted me to know that while he would not honor such a ridiculous demand, he could not stop the whispers it had started among other shop owners, and perhaps, he suggested, I might prefer to buy my meat in the next town over for a while until things cooled down. I thanked him, not because I agreed, but because he had shown me a small loyalty. And the next morning I drove. On a borrowed car a neighbor lent me with a wink, because he had heard about my keys being confiscated, to a butcher in a town where my name meant nothing, and I bought a modest selection of cuts I could freeze, not out of fear, but to make a point that even an old man can adapt when others try to tighten the noose of inconvenience around his neck. By then, I had begun to keep a ledger, a habit learned long ago in the shop when numbers told the truth even when people did not. In it I recorded dates, times, names, the phrases people used when they thought they were being kind but were actually sharpening the knife, the transactions Elaine initiated without my consent, the appointments scheduled for me as though my days were an open field anyone might plant. And as the pages filled, I noticed something that turned the raw ache of betrayal into a colder resolve. There was a pattern not only in the humiliations, but in the timing, a rhythm that suggested money was the metronome, because each wave of concern, the meal plans, the doctor's letters, the wellness checks, arrived just after. Some financial move was attempted, a freeze at the bank, a credit application, a deposit to the senior facility. And I realized that their argument about meat was not a debate about cholesterol, but a campaign to establish a narrative of incompetence, strong enough to justify stepping into my accounts and eventually my house. They pressed again one afternoon, with a stunt that would have been farce if it had not been so grave. Elaine and Greg arrived unannounced with a mobile notary and a stack of documents clipped together, and they said there had been a misunderstanding with the bank that a limited financial power of attorney could clear up, temporary and revocable, and strictly for my benefit, and how lucky that the notary was in the neighborhood today and could witness my signature, and how fortunate that Sarah and Daniel could serve as additional witnesses because it takes a village. And I felt the room tilt for a moment as I pictured myself signing away the last of my defenses under the hot lights of their impatience. Then I breathed, asked for my reading glasses, and read every line slowly while they shifted in their seats. And when I reached the clause that granted broad authority not only to manage accounts, but to open new ones, to sell property, to endorse checks, I set the pages down and said evenly that any document that gave another adult the right to sell a house he did not buy could not be limited. And I stood, not shaky at all, and walked to the front door and held it open. When Greg rose quickly and placed his hand around my wrist as if to suggest that frailty would make me easier to steer, I looked at his hand and then at his face until he removed it, and I said again, in a quieter voice that somehow carried more weight, that they would leave now. They threatened to call APS again, and I said they were welcome to call whomever they liked, because truth is not afraid of a clipboard. And the notary, a woman who had intended to spend 10 easy minutes witnessing something she did not understand, fled down the steps without looking back. That night, unable to sleep, I sat at the kitchen table under the pool of lamplight and thought about Margaret, about how she would have handled this with grace and maybe a touch of mischief. And I began to consider that if they were intent on turning my life into a case study, then I would give them a study they would not forget. Not a shouted confrontation or a lawsuit announced in the newspaper. Not yet. But something that would expose the brittleness of their smug certainties and remind them, in a way they could neither deny nor spin, that I am still a man who decides what goes on his plate. I started to plan a dinner, a proper family dinner like the ones we used to have when the kids were small and the world felt large and simple. But this time, I would decide the menu and the script, and I would do it with the patience of a slow braise, preparing dishes that would look and smell like the approved foods they prefer, while being, in their essence, the very thing they had tried to strip from me. I took out old notebooks where Margaret had jotted down recipes, and I called an old friend from church who once worked as a chef and asked him about flavors that can wear masks, mushrooms that can cloak the depth of beef, herbs that can dress a broth until it reads as vegetable to the nose, grinding and slow-cooking cuts until they surrender their secrets into sauces that pass for something else entirely. And as we spoke, I felt not the thrill of vengeance, but the steadier satisfaction of reclaiming a tool I had always owned. The quiet, stubborn art of feeding people and, in a sense, feeding them, telling them something true. The next morning, Elaine texted, a curt little message whose politeness could not hide its threat. No more meat in the house. Consider this your last warning. We will do what is necessary. And I looked at those words for a long time, then put the phone face down beside the cutting board, took a deep breath, and set about sharpening my knives, not as weapons, but as instruments of an old man's craft. Because if they believed that calling me too old to eat meat would shame me into surrender, they had forgotten who taught them to sit at a table, who paid for the roof under which they now planned their little confiscations, and who, even when pushed to a corner, could still invite them to dinner and, with a steady hand, feed them their own words. The night of the dinner I had planned arrived with a calmness that belied the storm inside me. And for the first time in months I felt like the master of my own house again. Not a patient under surveillance or a subject of whispered reports, but a man who had chosen every detail of the evening with the precision of someone preparing both a feast and a lesson. I rose early that morning, sharper than I had felt in years, and laid out the cuts of beef I had purchased discreetly in the next town over. Meat that I seasoned slowly with Margaret's old blend of garlic, rosemary, and cracked pepper, letting it, Rest as the flavors worked their way in. In the pot on the stove, a broth simmered with bones and onions until the whole house smelled of warmth, though I masked the aroma by sautéing mushrooms and vegetables so that when the children arrived, they would believe it was only lentil stew and roasted root crops. I worked for hours, kneading dough for bread, layering a casserole that looked like eggplant and quinoa, but carried within it the richness of ground beef cooked so tender it could fool even the most suspicious tongue. And by late afternoon, the table was set, the candles waiting to be lit, the wine breathing in its glass. When they walked in, Elaine first, brisk as ever, Greg behind her with his habitual smirk, the grandchildren glued to their phones, I greeted them with the kind of warmth I had not shown in weeks, the warmth of a host in command of his evening. They looked surprised but pleased, as though they had won a small battle by coaxing me back into what they called normal routines. Elaine commented that the house smelled good, though she wrinkled her nose, as if unsure what exactly she was, inhaling, and Greg joked about whether the fire department should be on standby. I let their words slide off me, because tonight they would learn that underestimation is the most dangerous mistake you can make with an old man who has nothing left to lose. We sat, and I ladled out bowls of the broth, rich and dark, while explaining in casual tones that it was a new recipe inspired by a vegetarian cafe downtown. They accepted the bowls without suspicion, and I watched as they tasted, nodding approval, remarking on the depth of flavor. Sarah even said, "See, Grandpa, you don't need steak to make something good." And I smiled inwardly at the irony. The bread was passed, the casserole unveiled, plates filled with generous portions of what they thought was safe, meatless fare, and as they ate, praising the tenderness, I felt a steadiness in my chest, not triumph, but justice, the satisfaction of having quietly reclaimed my role at the table. Then, when they were deep into their second helpings, I set down my fork and spoke in the calm, deliberate tone of a man testifying at his own trial. "You've been telling me for months that I am too old to eat meat, too old to choose for myself, too old to know what's good for me. Tonight, you've eaten every bite of the food I cooked. Do you feel weaker for it? Do you feel endangered?" They looked at me, puzzled, chewing slowly. Elaine gave a nervous laugh and said, "Dad, what are you talking about?" And I told them, still in that calm voice, that every dish they had just praised was made with the very thing they had tried to strip from me, that the broth was beef marrow, the casserole ground chuck, the bread brushed with bacon fat. The flavors they claimed to despise had nourished them without their knowledge. And I asked them whether they still believed meat was poison, or whether their words had been poison instead. The room went still. Forks paused mid-air, faces frozen between disbelief and anger. Greg was the first to recover, slamming his hand on the table, shouting that I had tricked them, endangered them, that this was proof of my instability. And Sarah shrieked that she would vomit if she had eaten dead animal. Elaine's face turned pale, her lips trembling, not only with fury, but with the recognition that she had been outmaneuvered, that the narrative of incompetence she had built so carefully had cracked under the weight of her own hypocrisy. I raised my hand to quiet them, and when they fell silent, I leaned forward and said, "You called me too old to eat meat. Tonight you ate it yourselves, and you thanked me for it. You have been fed your own words, and they taste no better than mine." I could see the grandchildren's faces flush, not with shame, but with the discomfort of children who realize too late that their mockery has circled back on them. Elaine tried to recover, insisting this was reckless, that I had proven nothing but my own inability to follow doctor's orders. But I was ready. I stood, walked to the cabinet, and retrieved the small recorder I had purchased weeks before. the same one I had left running on the counter during their visits, the one that had captured their discussions about guardianship, about freezing my accounts, about locking me away in a facility while using my name to siphon funds. I placed it on the table, pressed play, and let their voices fill the room. Not mine, not accusations, but their own words betraying them in front of their children. The silence that followed was heavier than any I had ever heard in that house. Sarah's phone slipped from her hand. Greg's face hardened into a mask of anger, but also fear. And Elaine closed her eyes as if by shutting them she could erase the evidence. When the recording ended, I spoke again, my voice steady but edged with the steel they had forgotten I possessed. This house is mine. My money is mine. My choices are mine. You may mock me, you may slander me, but you will not steal from me. I am not senile. I am not incompetent. And if you attempt again to interfere with my life under the guise of care, these recordings will not remain in this room. They will go to my lawyer, to the bank, to the court, to every person you tried to convince that I was unfit. Elaine began to weep then, not from remorse, but from the collapse of her strategy, and Greg muttered curses under his breath, glaring at me with the look of a man who has discovered that the prey he thought cornered still has teeth. I felt no triumph in that moment, only the weary satisfaction of justice served, a justice not delivered by the courts or the agencies, but by my own hands at my own table. For the first time in months I saw them stripped of their superiority, not children guiding an old man, but schemers exposed in front of their own offspring. And though the weight of their betrayal still pressed on my chest, I also felt a measure of release, because I had taken back what they tried to take from me, my voice, my authority, my dignity. When they left that night, angry, shaken, unable to look me in the eye, I stood at the door and watched their cars disappear into the dark street. The house was silent again, but it was a different silence, not the silence of defeat, but the silence of survival. I walked back to the table, where the candles still burned low and the dishes sat half-finished, and I poured myself a final glass of wine. Raising it toward the empty chair where Margaret once sat, I whispered, "They thought I was too old to eat meat, but tonight they learned I am not too old to defend myself." And as I drank, I felt not young again, not invincible, but steady as the oak beams above me, a man who had been tested and had not yielded. In the quiet that followed their departure, I washed the dishes slowly, not because they needed it, but because the warm water steadied my hands, and the circular motion of a sponge over a plate felt like a way to smooth the jagged edge of the night. And when the kitchen was clean and the candles were puddles of wax, I sat with a pad of paper and began to write down the things that would change. In the morning, I took that list to an elder law attorney recommended by my old friend from the hardware store, a woman with a level gaze who didn't talk to me like I was a fragile clock. With her, I drafted a living trust that names a bank fiduciary as successor trustee, a springing power of attorney that triggers only if two unrelated physicians certify incapacity, and a healthcare directive that places decision-making with my pastor, and a neighbor who knows the difference between caution and control, while explicitly excluding my children from any authority over my body or my accounts. I asked that my will be revised so that the bulk of my estate funds a community supper program at church in Margaret's name, a fund that buys real food and serves it hot to people who would rather be full than fashionable. And I left a smaller portion for Sarah and Daniel that vests if and only if they complete a simple requirement I think their grandmother would have approved. Spend 12 Sunday evenings over a year serving meals there. No selfies, no hashtags, just aprons and plates and the soft knowledge of what dignity tastes like when it is handed to you by someone who remembers your name. None of this was revenge, not really. It was housekeeping, a way to set rooms to rights after the wind has blown through and scattered what you thought would always stay put. The calls came for a while with the erratic rhythm of guilt. Elaine sobbing on a Tuesday evening to say I had humiliated her. Greg on a Thursday afternoon threatening to consult another lawyer. Sarah texting paragraphs that felt like comments meant for an audience instead of a grandfather. Daniel sending a single line that read, "I didn't know," and I answered only once, to tell Elaine that the door in my life is not locked from the inside, but she will need to knock and wait. And when I open it, she will need to come in empty-handed, not with forms or plans, but with the plain apology a daughter can give a father when she remembers he is a person and not a project. I rekeyed the locks anyway, not out of fear, but to mark the line I had drawn, and I gave a spare to my neighbor Ruth, who checks on me without making a show of it and leaves rhubarb pies on my stoop when the season is right. At church, Pastor Tom prayed with me in a side pew and then asked, in that honest way of his, how I wanted him to speak if gossip came around again. I told him the truth doesn't need a speech, just a short sentence that lands like a stake. Harold is managing. Harold is not alone. Harold is in God's hands and also his own. And that was the end of it there. The butcher in town waved me back behind the counter one slow afternoon and pressed a wrapped package into my hands with a grin that said the world still contains small loyalties. He told me the gossip had drifted on like smoke and that anyone who raised an eyebrow could take their business to the freezer aisle. I have found that if you leave people to choose between spectacle and decency, most will eventually remember what decency feels like, the way muscle remembers a movement learned in youth. I did not expect forgiveness to arrive like a trumpet, and it didn't. It came in modest pieces and sometimes in silence. I took the grill out of the garage again and replaced the tank by myself, slower than I once did but steady. And on the first warm evening of June, I set a ribeye on the grate and listened to the old music of fat meeting flame. And in that sound, I heard Margaret laugh, the laugh she saved for moments when I had made something right with my hands. And I set a second plate on the picnic table as I used to, and then, after a minute, I set it back in the cupboard, because I have learned that this new life is not about pretending the empty chair is full, but about honoring the space it keeps. On Thursdays, I drive to the community hall and chop onions for the supper crew. And the first time a man around my age told me the stew tasted like the kind his mother made, I felt a private relief. Because the best defense against being turned into a symbol is to be useful at something ordinary. Sometimes Ruth joins me, and we ride home with the windows down, smelling like broth and smoke. And I think of all the small ways dignity is rebuilt. One pot washed, one table wiped, one person looked in the eye without the need to fix or classify them. As for my children, I decided I would not be the bailiff of their punishment. Time is good at carving its own sentences, and I have no wish to be the warden of a prison I'd have to visit every day. I wrote each of them a letter in longhand, not to scold or defend, but to set down the terms on which we might walk the rest of the road without tripping each other. There will be no recordings and no tests, no surprise appointments, no conversations. About my diet. There will be dinner here once a month if they choose, and I will cook, and they will eat what is served, or they will eat later somewhere else. And if they come, they will speak to me as a man who raised them, not as a problem to be solved. I placed a copy of those letters with my lawyer, because clarity is a kindness, even when it feels like a wall. And then I folded the originals and mailed them with stamps from the roll Margaret bought long ago, with the cardinal on it, a little red, bird flying through a field of white, a reminder that small bright things still cross the distance between us, whether we deserve them or not. I am not naive enough to pretend the wound is gone. There are mornings when I wake and reach for the old phone. Think of dialing Elaine to tell her about the way the light looks on the neighbor's maple. Then remember the weight of the things she said and the machine of the plan she built and set the receiver down again. But there are other mornings when the coffee smells like it used to, and the pan warms under my palm and the steak sears just so. And I cut it with a knife I sharpened myself and eat it slowly. Not in defiance anymore, but in gratitude. Because the taste is not just meat. It is the stubborn proof that a man's last right is to be faithful to his own ordinary joys. They called me too old to eat meat. Perhaps in the arithmetic of years I am too old for many things. What I am not too old for is choosing. For blessing what is on my plate and who is at my table. Even if it is only me. Even if the blessing is whispered. Even if the listening ear belongs to the woman I loved, and the God who keeps the ledger of what we tried to do with the time we were given. When I finish, I wash the dish, wipe the counter, and open the window to let the evening in. And out in the yard the grill cools like a tired star. And I think, not with triumph, but with a quiet that feels like truth, that the best flavor after all is the one Margaret named long ago without knowing it, the taste of a will that is still my own.